Imagine hearing that the most powerful figure in early modern Europe wore no crown at all, a banker named Jakob Fugger. Converted into today's money, his fortune would hover near $400 billion. But his true power was never merely arithmetic. He lent to princes and popes, underwrote wars and building campaigns, and could tug policy across borders whenever it served his business. At his zenith, he functioned as an uncrowned ruler, pushing the evolution of capitalism and finance forward while, paradoxically, helping to fracture the continent so badly that it would later burn through decades of war. How did a weaver's grandson rise to such altitude, and why did his ascent cast a shadow that stretched for generations? This is the story of Jakob Fugger. Begin at the looms. His grandfather, Hans Fugger, started as a peasant weaver in the Swabian village of Graben. There were no estates or coats of arms, only calloused hands and a mind determined to escape dependency. Hans left the fields for Augsburg, a free imperial city, where guilds, courts, and civic rights gave ambitious craftsmen leverage against feudal lords. He married into guild families twice across his life, which unlocked trading privileges and a seat at civic tables. The textile trade made his first profits. Steady habits and careful alliances preserved them. By the end of his career, Hans had joined the guild committee and the city's great council. He didn't bequeath a fortune so much as a method. Work precisely, keep clean books, diversify, choose partners wisely, and never let politics happen to you by accident. Jakob I, Hans's son, applied that method with rigor. He avoided reckless wagers and spread risk across goods and routes, durable cloth, fustian, spices, gems, loans to reliable borrowers, even the rarefied commerce and holy relics that princes purchased at princely prices. In 1563, he entered Augsburg's Merchants' Guild, a badge that mattered because reputation itself functioned as collateral. Jakob Fugger and his wife Barbara had 11 children and turned the household into a disciplined enterprise. Among those children, the youngest, also named Jacob, would overturn expectations. As a boy, he leaned toward a clerical life. In another timeline, he might have taken orders and climbed the church's ladder. His brothers saw something else, a preternatural feeling for numbers, and pressed him into the firm, then dispatched him to Europe's finishing school of finance, Venice. Venice in the 1470s was a living academy. On and around the Rialto, young Jakob learned double-entry bookkeeping, bills of exchange, discounting, the pricing of risk, and the delicate art of turning far-off promises into present cash. He studied how merchants lawfully compensated for delay and danger in a world where the theology of usury was still in force. He watched partnerships built from parchment and trust, and he inhaled the information, markets, exchange rates, grain prices, ship news that made credit move. When he returned in his mid-20s and took charge of the Innsbruck branch, he immediately broke the family mold. He was brilliant, but unlike his cautious elders, he was comfortable with calculated danger. Where they sought safety, he hunted leverage. His first great target had a name that frightened conservative bankers: Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol, the Habsburg lord, with grand taste and chaotic ledgers. Sigismund adored pageantry tournaments, pageants, and parties legendary for excess, including a tale about a dwarf leaping from a pie to wrestle a giant. Behind the spectacle lay a mess of unpaid notes. Large houses kept their distance. Fugger stepped forward. He began with small, tight loans that proved reliability and built access. Then came the opening. A clash with Venice left the Archduke strapped for cash. Big firms refused him. Their account books said his credit was done. Fugger scoured every corner of his network and raised 100,000 florins, tens of millions in modern terms. The genius lay less in the amount than in the architecture. He demanded hard collateral and control points that could not be waved away by noble whim. Access to treasuries, oversight of mints, a grip on revenues. Competitors laughed at the risk. Then the wagons arrived, train after train, of Tyrolean silver rolling into Fugger warehouses. The gamble worked, paying him handsomely, and, more importantly, unlocking a door that noble privilege had kept shut: mining. In Silesia, he partnered with engineers, surveyed veins, and leased the richest deposits. In Tyrol, he helped make Schwaz a boom town, the largest mining metropolis of its age, a thicket of shafts, wheels, pumps, ore stamps, and smelters. Copper poured from the furnaces, silver from the refining hearths, and with metals came influence. Copper mattered beyond coin, cast into cannon and shot. It set the tempo of sieges and campaigns. By coordinating production and sales, the Fuggers edged toward monopoly, able to meter supply and shape price. Scale demanded structure. In 1494, Jakob organized a company with 54,000 guilders in capital. 2 years later, he doubled the stake by bringing in the Prince Bishop of Brixen as a silent partner. His aim was plain: weld a copper monopoly and convert industrial control into continental leverage. He built foundries across Central Europe, enlarged his sales network, and made Antwerp the northern hub, a city where Asian spices, Baltic timber, and New World silver all brushed shoulders. Success drew tests. When the Prince Bishop died, the papacy claimed the inheritance, freezing a large share of the firm's capital inside church law. Fugger did not panic. He went to Rome, negotiated in corridors and antechambers, leaned on friends in the Curia, and loosened the knot. The lesson bit deep. Without political power, money sits exposed. Without money, political promises ring hollow. He pivoted from his first patron, Sigismund, toward a stronger one, Maximilian of Habsburg. The partnership reshaped maps. Fugger bankrolled campaigns that tightened Maximilian's grip, and when force replaced argument, he helped fund the seizure of Vienna. In return, the emperor opened Hungary's copper heartlands to the firm. Fugger rationalized leases, standardized ore purchases, improved transport so metal could move year-round, and by 1507 received the lordships of Kirchberg and Weissenhorn merchants, stepping into the circles of the high nobility. Rivals pressed the emperor to curtail Augsburg's upstart. Fugger pressed back, mobilizing dukes and bishops to make clear how essential his credit had become. In time, honors matched reality, and imperial recognition ratified the power he already wielded. Then came the matter of succession. Maximilian was failing, and the imperial crown would be decided by electors who expected promises backed by coin. Fugger counted the votes and the costs. He assembled a war chest and underwrote the campaign of Maximilian's grandson, Charles of Habsburg, already a sovereign in Spain. The sums were vast, and the decisive share came from Augsburg. When Charles won the imperial title in 1519, it was an open secret that the crown rested on credit as much as lineage. Fugger, ever the hedger, kept lines to other courts Tudor England, the Valois, Italian princes whose markets and mints oiled Mediterranean trade, but his next grand stage was Rome. North to south money flows needed reliable carriers. Fugger secured the contracts to transfer German donations to the papal treasury, and soon earned a nickname, God's banker. He advanced pay to the Swiss Guard, managed remittances from the sale of indulgences, and from 1508 to 1515 his house led the Roman mint. By then he held Europe's twin levers, the emperor's purse and the pope's. Those levers lifted stone, monumental projects, from the Sistine Chapel ceiling to the rising fabric of St. Peter's, often outpaced ordinary revenues. Augsburg credit kept work moving when treasuries ran thin. Power also meant saying no. In 1523, he sent Emperor Charles a crisp letter reminding him to settle arrears and noting, with cold accuracy, that without Fugger's money, there would have been no imperial crown. It wasn't bluster, it was bookkeeping. His innovations were legal and institutional as much as industrial. Medieval theology condemned usury interest charged for time alone, yet commerce required transparent mechanisms to compensate for risk, delay, and service. Through instruments such as bills of exchange, exchange fees, time price contracts, and annuities, merchants had long navigated the gray. Fugger was among those pressing Rome to clarify where licit gain ended and sinful usury began so that honest credit could breathe. As authorities refined those distinctions, Europe's financial lungs expanded. His network ran far beyond the Alps. Antwerp became the hinge of a system that matched European copper with Portuguese spices. Metal sent to Lisbon paid for pepper. Pepper sold in the Low Countries paid for coin. Coin paid soldiers and taxes. Taxes secured new concessions that protected the mines. Because bills settled balances at the fairs of Lyon and in Genoa's banks, the firm could finance movement without hauling endless chests along brigand-haunted roads. Still, the legacy that would ignite the fiercest argument was one he never intended. the administration of indulgence revenues made his seal visible wherever preachers promised remission of penalties. Critics looked at the traffic in salvation and saw a scandal, proof that Rome had monetized grace and that a merchant had captured the church's purse. In 1517, a monk in Saxony, Martin Luther, circulated 95 propositions against abuses tied to indulgences and the broader economy of spiritual shortcuts. The pamphlets raced across Europe, and many angry lines the public drew passed straight through a banker in Augsburg. At the same time, moralists attacked the growing legitimacy of interest by other names, and preachers blamed new credit practices for trapping the poor. Ready loans helped towns and traders expand, but predatory contracts tightened cycles of arrears and forfeiture. Resentment gathered around three poles: the Pope, the Emperor, and the banker, who seemed to stand behind both. Fused with the ambitions of princes, those resentments helped destabilize Europe. The Reformation shattered religious unity. Rulers chose confessions along lines shaped by belief and by interest. Tax revolts intertwined with dynastic competition. A century later, the tinder roared. The 30 Years' War scoured German lands, emptying towns and turning fields to waste. Some regions lost around a fifth of their people, others far more. It would be foolish to blame a single financier for a cataclysm with many roots, but the systems Fugger helped build monopolies in war medals, politicized credit, and a tight braid between pulpit and purse fed the blaze. What of the man himself? Paradoxically, he lived with restraint. Visitors noted a merchant more interested in letters and ledgers than in feasts. He cared less for display than for outcomes, and once summed up his creed with a plain line: "I intend to gain while I can." He needed that focus. Scale brought storms, lawsuits from cities and princes, miners' strikes and accidents, attempts by Hungarian estates to nationalize operations, and uprisings in his own Augsburg. The German Peasants' War of 1524-1525 shook the social order just as his health began to fail. The Reformation undercut the papal finance he had mastered and cast suspicion on every link in its chain, from indulgence hawkers to the bankers who carried the funds. He defended the old framework and his place within it, but the tide was turning. He died in the winter of 1525 at 66. Without children, he left the firm to his nephew Anton, along with agencies from Lisbon and Antwerp to Venice and Rome, contracts binding minds to mints and mints to monarchies, and a reputation that would echo through centuries. So what, finally, did Jakob Fugger change? If the Medici pioneered the architecture of Renaissance finance, Fugger industrialized it. He pushed vertical integration to imperial-scale mines, smelters, mints, credit, and courts linking raw earth to refined coin and then to royal policy. He demonstrated that private capital, deployed with information and discipline, could tilt the fate of crowns and conclaves. He helped force a theological reckoning with time and risk, and he proved, more starkly than any contemporary, that in a Europe of many small states, a well-capitalized house could operate like a sovereign. At his peak, he could threaten the strongest ruler with nothing more than a ledger and a letter. His loans to Maximilian did not simply supply coin. They redrew the map, fortifying Habsburg claims in Hungary, and sheltering the mines that fed his furnaces. His Antwerp network turned copper into pepper and pepper into profit. Agents used the lion fairs to settle accounts, Genoese banks to clear transfers, and Venetian brokers to place insurance and pick up intelligence. Information faster, better, more credible was as vital as metal. Inside the firm, discipline bordered on obsession. Branch ledgers were standardized so accounts in Venice could be reconciled with those in Antwerp in a single sitting. Partners reported positions frequently, reconciling cash, bills, and commodities line by line. Agents rotated to prevent cozy local interests from capturing policy. Credit lines to princes were pegged to collateral mines, tolls, taxes, or mints and capped, unless new pledges arrived. If a borrower failed, the house preferred liens that produced cash flow over glittering but idle titles. Rivals never stopped probing. The Welsers challenged for shares in mining and colonial access. Italian houses courted the same courts. Hanseatic traders tried to dominate Baltic copper flows. Fugger countered with longer leases, faster logistics, closer ties to rulers, and a reputation for keeping promises. When he couldn't outbid, he outorganized. When he couldn't outorganize, he outweighted. He could also be implacable. When debtors stalled, he sued. When a mine gang threatened sabotage, he replaced managers and fortified sites. When a town delayed payment, he withheld deliveries until accounts squared. The letters could sound cold, but the principle never wavered. Credit is a promise with a date. That clarity made enemies and allies because suppliers and soldiers trusted a house that settled on time. Behind the scenes ran a courier web that stitched Augsburg to Innsbruck, Venice, Rome, Antwerp, Lyon, and Lisbon. Packets carried exchange rates, bullion tallies, ship lists, and court gossip. Out of these grew regular newsletters, early digests of political and commercial news. In a world before newspapers, credible intelligence was a tradable asset, letting the house arrive at fairs with the right prices and leave before trouble. Loop by loop, the model repeated: dig ore, smelt metal, mint coin, move goods, net balances, and reinvest. That flywheel of integration and information explains how a single private firm could influence popes and emperors without fielding an army. To see how Venice shaped his craft, imagine ledgers with mirrored columns, debit and credit so, that every entry is checked by a counter-entry. Fugger learned to shorten cash cycles by discounting bills before fairs, and to hedge exchange risk by matching payables and receivables across cities months ahead. He studied marine insurance, harvest reports, and exchange tables, training himself to treat information as a form of capital. He also codified partnership rules, profit shares, audit calendars, rotation of agency heads, and report templates that made branch data comparable. When he lent to princes, he demanded things he could touch: toll houses with his men at the counters, mints whose first strikes went to his account, or salt works with audited output. With succession politics, the money was structured. Pensions, annuities, and offices mapped to revenue streams, not ad hoc gifts. He supplied roughly 2/3 of the 800,000-plus guilder kitty that crowned Charles and kept exact records, which is why his 1523 reminder to pay read more like an audit than a plea. In Rome, archbishoprics were rich in income, but poor in cash. Fugger advanced fees due to the curia and organized repayment from cathedral revenues and indulgence receipts arrangements that made his seal visible wherever preachers promised remission and thus made him a lightning rod when abuses flared. Industrial detail mattered. Investments in wheels, drainage, timber supply, and safer smelting raised output and reduced stoppages. Contracts with charcoal burners, carters, and raftmen kept costs predictable. Control from pit to port let governments buy artillery metal on reliable schedules. Paperwork kept it all moving. Bills drawn in Augsburg and payable in Lyon, or settled in Genoa, cleared balances without dragging chests over the Alps, while Antwerp brokers married copper to pepper in trades that minimized idle cash. Rivals tried to break the choreography at weak links. Consistency usually beat price. Philanthropy formed a quieter strand. In Augsburg, he endowed the Fuggerei, a walled housing quarter where needy citizens still live for a token rent, and a daily prayer social policy by private means. Critics called it reputation laundering. Supporters called it duty. None of this softened his business edges. He kept blacklists for chronic defaulters, wrote crisis playbooks, and trained agents to seize pledged assets with the least friction the law allowed. When diplomacy failed, courts decided. His lawyers knew local statutes from Swabia to the Tyrol. The Reformation reframed money itself. By attacking indulgence abuses, Luther made every financial tie to Rome suspect, giving cities and princes a pretext to redirect or delay payments. Fugger fought to keep contracts honored, but could not stop a tide powered by pulpit and print. The Peasants' War then shook the bottom rungs. Rebels torched archives, blocked roads, and besieged towns. Supply lines snapped, and debt service faltered. When order returned, his health was gone. He left instructions to protect core businesses and to avoid confusing size with safety. If you made it to the end, drop a crown emoji in the comments so I know you were here. And consider subscribing for more deep dives into the fortunes and families that wrote Europe's playbook, starting with the Medici, whose saga pairs perfectly with this one.